once you have flown private and you're able to continue doing so, it's very difficult to go back. We're in the hangar now, or one of the hangars at Farnborough Airport, but perhaps not with a relatively small amount of money. I'm James Jaffa. I'm the founding partner of the law firm Jaffa Co. We specialise in two key asset classes, the first being super yachts and mega yachts, and the second being aircraft, business and private jets. And we are based in several locations, but today we're filming from our base at Farnborough Airport. We love it here. It's a fantastic place to be an aviation lawyer because our client base can fly in and see us, and we catch them as they pass in and out. And it also allows me to sit on the steps of something a bit more interesting than your typical law firm boardroom. We're on the steps of, I think today, a Challenger 650. Given to us for the day by our friends at TAG Aviation, so thanks for that. And I've been asked by Citywealth to provide a brief rundown on the process of buying an aircraft, and also some of the intricacies and market details that we've seen over the last 12 months or so with COVID-19, how the market's changed, because it has. We get asked a lot what goes into buying an aircraft, and first it depends what you're buying. So we specialise in newly manufactured aircraft, but we also advise on a bread and butter basis on used brokerage aircraft. And we'll take that as an example today because it's where the bulk of the market sits. And we could use a typical example of a 2015 Global 6000 being sold for $20 million. And in aircraft sales, we typically use US dollars as the benchmark the world over. And we would ordinarily become involved in a transaction when a broker or a family office or another law firm that doesn't specialize in aviation matters picks up the phone and says, Jaffa Co, hi, we've done a deal, we've agreed a sales price, we've got a willing buyer, please help. And at that point we say, thank you very much, we'd be delighted to. And we say the first stage for us is a letter of intent. So the parties agree commercial terms, sales price, roughly where the aircraft might be delivered, and any other peculiarities that the buying and selling principals might agree between themselves. And we say, let's put all of that in a letter of intent. And just as with every other asset class the world over, the letter of intent isn't contractually binding. You're not legally bound to one another. But what it does is it sets out the details of what we're doing, what we've agreed, in a very short form, page or two, so everybody can reference it later. And unlike other asset classes where you might throw out a letter of intent in a very short period of time, with aircraft sales, the letter of intent is much more thought out and heavily negotiated. But that has the advantage that when we come to the actual contract stage, most of the negotiation has been done and we get to a signed contract much more quickly. So the work is very much front-loaded at the letter of intent stage. And once an LOI, as we call it has been signed, the buyer would ordinarily pay a deposit to an escrow agent, usually 10% of the sales price. That gets paid and held, but it's still held for the buyer's order. So until there's a binding contract, the 10% still belongs to them, but it's a good show of faith. Once we've done that, the lawyers get together again and they say, right, let's prepare a binding contract, which is called an aircraft purchase agreement, an APA. And the APA is not a standard form document. So unlike other asset classes, such as super yachts, where 90% of the world's luxury yacht transactions are done on an industry standard template. We don't have that in aircraft sales, which has its advantages and disadvantages. Every lawyer, every aviation lawyer will have their own precedent that they know and they enjoy using, and they've put together using the experience of many transactions with all the things that we learn on different deals. And I don't care what anybody tells you, every transaction there's something to be learned. And typically the selling lawyer will use their preferred contract, and they'll insert the details that have been agreed in the letter of intent. The APA gets signed, and at that point the 10% deposit becomes fixed. So it's contractual, and the buyer will only be able to get that 10% deposit back on the occurrence of certain specific events. So for example, if the aircraft fails the inspection, the survey phase, or if the seller failed to deliver the aircraft upon delivery. And likewise, if the buyer was to breach the contract, the deposit would typically go to the seller. And it's at that point then that we know we've really got a deal. So you've got a committed buyer and a committed seller with money paid. The seller is bound. So as long as the aircraft meets the delivery condition, they can't back out of the sale. And even if they do try to reverse out, it would be very difficult. So at this point, everybody breathes a big sigh of relief, because we've got a happy seller, a happy buyer, and 9 out of 10, or 9.5 times out of 10, we'll have a happy deal. But once we've got a signed contract, you've got your deposit, we'll go through to an inspection phase. So the buyer gets the chance to do a pre-purchase inspection, a PPI. And the PPI is the equivalent of a survey. And it will be carried out by possibly the manufacturer of the aircraft, or a manufacturer-approved service provider, or simply a third-party service provider that the buyer trusts, but also which the seller agrees to. And it's a collaborative process, because there's a certain element of destructive inspection of an aircraft of this nature. The buyer's entitled to really understand her condition, and looking for things like corrosion, which is quite common to a certain extent, and that takes a fair amount of looking underneath the skin. And of course the seller wants to know that that's going to be undertaken by a qualified service provider that's not going to ruin their aircraft. So the parties would agree the service provider, and once the PPI, the inspection, is complete, hopefully the aircraft sails through with no issues at all, but I can't remember a time when I ever saw that. And we've done transactions worth billions. This year alone, we've done aircraft transactions worth 2.5 billion, and we're at the end of July. And if defects are discovered during the PPI, the seller will have committed in the contract to put them right. So the seller needs to deliver the aircraft in a particular physical condition known as the delivery condition. And ordinarily that will be an airworthy aircraft as certified and signed off by the manufacturer and the other regulatory bodies. And as long as they put the aircraft in that condition, they've complied with their obligations, and the buyer is bound to purchase it. And assuming that process follows the order of events that it should, you end up with a very happy seller, because they get a pot of money at the end, and you end up with a very happy buyer, because they have a shiny, beautiful aircraft that they can use and enjoy to fly around the world. We see a huge spectrum of different transactions, and that means we're pretty well placed to render an opinion on the last year or so. So we are now roughly 18 months post the introduction of, or acceptance of, COVID-19 into Western Europe and the US. And when COVID-19 first hit this part of the world, it's true that everything that wasn't firmly under contract switched off. Every client that was negotiating an aircraft sale or purchase became nervous, understandably, because none of us knew what the world was going to look like in the months and years to come. So everything got put on hold that could be, and it was a nervous time for the aviation industry, as with the world as a whole. And it's no secret that the aviation industry has had a difficult, turbulent time since then, but we're 18 months past that point, and now it's a really, really buoyant market. So the biggest problem aircraft brokers seem to have, from what I'm told, is finding quality inventory to sell. If there was ever a time when clients wanted to fly privately, now is it. And there's this whole segment of the aviation industry that could have flown privately before COVID, but chose not to because it was a bit too lavish, a bit too extravagant. Why would I do it when I can fly first class or business class? And what COVID has done is given us a reason, the best reason of all, which is I can fly privately and keep my family, friends, loved ones and myself safe. So I mentioned previously that we're sitting here at Farnborough Airport, and it's where we base ourselves on a day-to-day basis, and it's a prime example of the benefits of private aviation if you're fortunate enough to be able to utilize it. So you turn up here, you're welcomed at the gates warmly, you arrive at the front door, and probably as the crow flies, 200 feet away is your aircraft, and in between those 200 feet your bags get whisked away, your passports get whisked away, you are greeted with a glass of champagne or a coffee, and a quiet place to rest and relax for a few minutes before you're gently ushered onto your aircraft. And you don't come into contact with the public, you control your environment to a huge degree, you can keep away a safe distance from everybody, it's clean, it's sanitary, and if you're ever in an environment to fly and avoid COVID, this is it. And that alone is a fantastic reason to fly private, and more people are doing it. And those who are flying first class and business class are now chartering. Those who were chartering are now moving up into purchasing aircraft. And it's a really busy market. This surge in demand for private aviation will continue, there's no doubt about it, because if nothing else, even once the world returns to normal and COVID-19 gets under control on a global basis, which one presumes will happen one day, once you have flown private and you're able to continue doing so, it's very difficult to go back. But what aircraft really give you is time, and in a way that nothing else does. If you can be in your home having breakfast, you live, say, 30 minutes away from your chosen airport, you're on the aircraft within 45 minutes of having your breakfast, you fly, for example, to the Mediterranean to get onto your yacht, you can feasibly be on board your yacht within 3.5 hours after having your breakfast at home. As you can see behind me, we've got a Gulfstream, one of the premium pedigree manufacturers in private jets, business jets, and she's sitting here absolutely gleaming, ready to go, ready to be wheeled out the hangar at sometimes as little as 1 hour's notice. So you can be an owner and call your pilot and say, look, prepare the aircraft, I'd like to go shopping in Paris today, or I'd like a few days in the sun in the Bahamas, and they can have the aircraft ready and waiting for you, wheeled out, almost within minutes. We get asked regularly, that's great, but how complicated is it? How much of a headache? A lot of potential owners would prefer prefer to charter an aircraft rather than own it and have to go through the expense of maintenance and ongoing management, which is a good argument, but there's nothing comes close to actually owning your own aircraft, just like in my world, owning my car compared with a modern car sharing platform. And I also get asked, what's the time frame? So ordinarily, from agreeing commercial terms, mainly price, to preparing a letter of intent and then physical handover, we're looking at about 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks you can own one of these, registered to you, ready to fly, with a following wind and a bit of good luck, and good management of the whole process. So in a relatively short space of time, but perhaps not with a relatively small amount of money, you could be the proud owner of one of these, have it hanged here at Farnborough, to use it as your heart's content. Etiquette on board an aircraft is a difficult one. I mean, and in some ways it's a question that doesn't need answering, because when you walk into somebody's home, you perhaps take your shoes off, you might not, depends, because you're led very much by your host. And it's the same on board a jet. You're coming into an environment that's owned by whoever's inviting you on board. If you're chartering, it's a different story. If you're chartering, you can very much set the tone. So if you charter through TAG Aviation, for example, who I mentioned because they very kindly lent us the Challenger 650 a few minutes ago, they will give you a rundown of what you want from the journey. So what type of food do you enjoy? Is there something you don't like? Do you want to be left alone by the flight attendant? Do you want them to wait on your every whim? Do you want them to sit next to you the whole time? And it's very much guided by you. And again, that's what you're getting with this world. Whether it's a private jet or a super yacht, you're buying an experience that you dictate in a way that very few other things allow. And for that, it's very, very special. One of the things I touched on earlier in this video was how the market's changed over the last 12 months as the world started to come out of COVID. And what has happened is that those who are able to fly privately want to, because it's a means of doing the things that have to some extent been taken away from us. And one is now able to travel privately and with security and safely with one of these assets. And we have seen the market absolutely explode. So in the last 6 or 8 months, the biggest issue to be found is finding quality aircraft to sell. And we've got a typical example just today. We're negotiating the sale of a large heavy jet worth tens of millions of dollars. The buyer has raised some items which the seller's not happy with and doesn't feel are fair or contractual. And in the past, the buyer had the upper hand. So the buyer would say, look, these are my terms, I want that remedied, or I want a price reduction, or I'll go elsewhere. And in the past that worked, but at the moment the sellers are able to say, actually, no, I disagree, you're not complying with the contract terms, I'm not going to go that extra step because I think it's unfair and unnecessary, and I've got other buyers queuing up waiting to buy the aircraft from me. And in the past, a seller would be told that, or rather a buyer would be told that, and they'd think it was just sales tactics. But now it's true. So in this market now, buyers are losing out on deals and acquiring aircraft when they think it's a tiny industry when taken in the context of the global economy, and they think people cannot possibly be queuing up to spend tens of millions of dollars fighting over this same aircraft that I want. And before it was true, but now it's not. Now it's so busy. To take that example of today's aircraft, we'll have to see what the outcome is, but what I do know is the seller has the upper hand, and the seller, if they don't proceed with a particular purchaser, they will almost certainly sell the aircraft for good money, or even more money, in the very near future. And that is a big change of the last 6 to 8 months that we've seen.